Nintendo had notoriously strict quality standards, which, according to them, gave them the best games. In all fairness, they were right. That may have made sense, but Nintendo got greedy. They charged developers a hefty royalty fee, made developers pay for cartridges, and limited the games that developers could make in a year. All in all, developers were less than pleased with the restrictions. In most cases, they still adhered to Nintendo's requirements in order to develop for the system, while economic realities, the rise of Sega, and court decisions would ultimately force Nintendo to change its approach. Some developers, like Tengen, were able to find their way around Nintendo's restrictions. In this video, we're going to tell the story of how Tengen broke with Nintendo to produce their own games without the official Nintendo license, and how Nintendo cracked down on Tengen, ultimately prevailing in court. Nintendo did not mess around when it came to third-party developers. The company required developers to submit games to Nintendo for approval. Blood, gore, sexism, racism, and other content restrictions could apply. Nintendo charged a pretty good royalty fee for games sold, usually around 10 to 20%. They also made developers buy cartridges directly from Nintendo and limited the amount of games that a developer could create to 5 per year. They also had a 2-year exclusivity deal. Any game that appeared on the Nintendo could not appear on any other system during that time period. All this was done in the name of protecting quality, but it didn't hurt that Nintendo made a hefty profit and helped prevent any competition from gaining a foothold in the market. For most of the late 80s, Nintendo dominated the market, and with no competition. Once Nintendo arrived on the market, 1983 in Japan, 85 in America, and 86 in Europe, it more or less completely owned the home console market for the next 5 years, and was easily the best-selling console of the third generation. As such, developers were usually willing to adhere to Nintendo's requirements in order to earn that sweet, sweet seal of approval. And if they weren't, well, the 10NES was in the way. The 10NES was the lockout system that stopped unauthorized games. Every Nintendo console came with a sharp 4-bit SM590 microcontroller. This chip operated as a lock. When the game was inserted into the system, the lock would request a code from the key. The key was placed in every Nintendo game by Nintendo, who, as we noted above, was the only company that could manufacture a game. If the game failed to deliver the code, the lockout chip would activate, resetting the system and stopping the game from starting. However, no system was completely foolproof. Dozens of games from multiple developers still found their way onto the commercial market, as developers figured out ways around the 10NES system. These games were sold at fairs, on home shopping channels, or sometimes in major realtors. They were also often sold out of the United States or Europe. For example, one of the more prominent unlicensed video game developers was Wisdom Tree, which ironically sold Christian-themed video games, usually at Christian bookstores. These games included classics like Spiritual Warfare and Bible Adventures. Yeah, definitely need another video on that. The fact that these developers existed in the first place begs some questions. How were these developers able to pull this off? And what ultimately happened to them? Some, like Wisdom Tree, were likely able to avoid a lawsuit because Nintendo feared the backlash of going after a religious group. Some developers were able to get around the 10NES system via a voltage spike. These games came equipped with a charge pump. When the Nintendo was activated, so did a charge pump within the game. That charge pump would cause a spike of negative voltage to temporarily knock out the lockout chip, allowing the game to start. This was a relatively common method. The charge pump did present major developers with a problem. There were risks that the charge pump could damage systems. That could expose them to some serious liability. There were also questions about the reliability of this method, and as a result, major developers avoided the charge pump. So, let's talk about the hilarious and rather juvenile way that Tengen figured out the way around the 10NES. Tengen is an offshoot of Atari. Yes, that Atari. Except, not really. Okay. In 1984, Atari split into two companies. There was the Atari Corporation, which made computer games, the Atari console, and games for that console. Then there was Atari Games, which made arcade games. When the company sought to enter the market for other consoles, they needed to change their name to do so. Thus, Tengen was born. Tengen sought to develop for Nintendo and attempted to negotiate around Nintendo's licensing restrictions. Nintendo didn't budge, and Tengen folded, agreeing to Nintendo's terms. In 1988, Tengen released 3 licensed games for the Nintendo: RBA Baseball, Pac-Man, and Gauntlet. At the same time, there was a lot more happening behind the scenes. Most importantly is that Nintendo and Tengen were about to go to a legal war over Tetris. It's worth an entire other video, so here's the quick version. Atari and Nintendo each developed their own version of the most popular video game of all time, Tetris. Both companies believed that they had secured the rights to develop Alexei Pajitnov's legendary game, and both produced their own versions of the game. Atari sued Nintendo for $250 million in damages, and Nintendo countersued, alleging that Atari was infringing on Nintendo's patent for the game. Nintendo also brought down the economic hammer. If any retailers carried the unlicensed Tengen game, they could be cut off of future gaming supplies. That threat didn't stop Tengen, and on May 17, 1989, Tengen began to sell unlicensed versions of Tetris. Unknown to Nintendo, Tengen engineers were hard at work creating a workaround of the 10NES system, as they had been since 1986. They attempted to use a variety of methods, including monitoring electronic communications between the lock and key and chemically removing layers of the chip, but those failed. So, Tengen was reduced to using an old form of subterfuge. They lied to the US Patent Office, which, as a general rule, is a bad idea, although it worked. Follow this for a second. Part of the reason that no one could recreate the key for the 10NES system was because the source code for the chip was patented. The patent, of course, was held at the US Patent Office. Lawyers for Atari contacted the patent office and said that they needed a copy of the source code for a pending legal case. There was no such case, but it still worked! Tengen obtained the source code for the 10NES system through this really basic juvenile lie. Armed with this information, Tengen developed their key. Known as the Rabbit system, the Rabbit could generate a code that was functionally indistinguishable than any other code developed by the 10NES. Tengen had done it. They were able to produce and manufacture their own games regardless of Nintendo's license. While this had been done in the past, Tengen was the largest developer to do so. Ultimately, Tengen would go on to produce 15 unlicensed games. These included unlicensed versions of the 3 games noted above, as well as a variety of others, including Roadrunner, Miss Pac-Man, Klax, and more. Because they were unlicensed, Tengen cartridges looked a little different than the standard Nintendo ones. They were black, not gray, and slanted in the front. From here, as you would expect, we go to court. Atari sued first, alleging that Nintendo's licensing practices violated the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law which stopped monopolies in private enterprise. Nintendo countersued, alleging unfair competition and that Tengen had violated Nintendo's copyright and patent via their reverse engineering. The District Court for Northern California granted Nintendo a preliminary injunction, meaning that Tengen could not sell their unlicensed games. Things then get complicated. The court would later find that Tengen had, in fact, copied programming, in this case the source code, that was protected intellectual property of Nintendo. The copies of the games created because of this source code, the ones which contained the Rabbit program, were thus illegal, as the Rabbit program was functionally indistinguishable from the 10NES. They also found that Tengen had used unauthorized copies of the original source code by obtaining the code from the patent office through illicit means, in this case, lying to the patent office. What I would argue is even more interesting is the court actually said that reverse engineering was protected and Tengen was fine to do so, but the direct copying of the source code and the way in which the information was obtained was a problem. Now things would only get worse for Tengen. In 1990, a federal judge ruled that Nintendo could sue retailers who sold unlicensed games, meaning that major companies like Toys R Us and Walmart could be on the hook for economic damages if they sold games that were unlicensed. Atari appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, but they lost there too. The reason changed a little bit. The injunction was upheld, games couldn't be sold, but the court did find that Atari could have copied the code if they had obtained it through legitimate means, or at least, not lying to the government. This was a difficult 1-2 punch for Tengen. In 1989, a federal judge hearing the Tetris case also ruled in favor of Nintendo, saying that Nintendo, not Tengen, had a license for Tetris. As a result, Tengen had to issue refunds to retailers who had purchased the unlicensed Tetris game. Only an estimated 50,000 copies of the game were sold. In 1994, the suit over unlicensed games finally ended. Tengen paid Nintendo for damages and for the use of other intellectual property licenses. Now, Nintendo might have won this battle, but they did eventually lose the war. Nintendo's heavy-handed approach to its licensees ultimately caught the eye of the United States Federal Trade Commission, the federal government agency that is charged with consumer protection and regulation against monopolistic business practices. As early as 1989, a Democratic congressman, Dennis Eckert of Ohio, called on federal authorities to investigate Nintendo for price fixing. It was alleged that Nintendo was pressuring retailers to hold prices at levels Nintendo wanted, and used pressure tactics like withholding shipments of games to prevent retailers from discounting games. Attorneys general in New York and Maryland joined in the investigation, which reached a settlement in 1991. Nintendo had to stop price-fixing pressure tactics, tell retailers that they were free to set any price they wanted, and pay $4.75 million to 39 states to cover related legal costs. For consumers, Nintendo had to issue $25 million in $5 coupons to customers who had bought games between June 1988 and December 1990. Not everyone was happy. Among those who submitted public comment opposing the settlement was Sam Tramriel, president of Atari. Tramriel said that the settlement was insufficient, required no admission of wrongdoing by Nintendo, required no strong remedies to fix things going forward, and wasn't tough enough. The combination of government action and old-fashioned capitalism would, finally, force Nintendo to drop their draconian ways. Remember, Nintendo was basically the only game system in town, so they could afford to throw their weight around and crush the competition. And then that changed. Many developers, including Tengen, began to migrate to the Genesis. Among the reasons, its more flexible licensing requirements, including more reasonable royalty rates and less restrictive practices. When EA Games worked out a deal with Sega to license their games on the system, other developers followed, and the pressure of competition combined with a series of legal and regulatory enforcement methods pressured Nintendo to loosen their licensing restrictions, thus creating a much more fair system for game developers. In the 90s, Sega was able to recruit quite a few current and former Nintendo developers to the cause of their new Genesis. Among the developers, Tengen. Tengen would take 4 of their unlicensed games from Nintendo to the Genesis, including Afterburner 2, Alien Syndrome, Shinobi, and Fantasy Zone. They would wind up producing about 20 games for the system. Ultimately, Tengen became a victim of the constantly shifting corporate landscape. In 1994, Time Warner, which had purchased a controlling interest in Atari Games in 1993, reabsorbed the company into their broader corporation, thus forming Time Warner Interactive. That company would produce dozens of games going into 1997, and if you want more information on their corporate history, let me know in the comments because that's going to require another video. Here's the point. Tengen challenged Nintendo twice, and they lost twice. However, the loss for Tengen wasn't a loss for the rest of us. Tengen's legal fights with Nintendo set the stage for Nintendo's loss of near exclusive control over the video game market. That gave way to a slew of new innovative games, developers, and products. Honestly, Tengen did us all a favor. They helped to take down a giant by a peg or two and create a better video game ecosystem, one that all of us still enjoy today. And that is it for this edition of Almost Something. As always, I hope you enjoyed this weird intersection of video games and the legal world. If you did, please like and subscribe. You made it to the end of the video, so you must like what we have to say, and we will have more soon. Thank you for watching, everyone, and have a wonderful day out there.